Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. Today's topic was suggested by Simon absolutely ages ago. I am sorry it's taken me this long to get around to actually filming it. Simon also happened to suggest a very excellent title for this video, which I haven't used, but I am going to share. I didn't use it because, frankly, I was just too chicken. I was worried that maybe the censoring part of the algorithm might have some form of conniption if I had. Now, if I had been brave enough, this video would, arguably should have carried the title, There Ain't Half Been Some Lucky Bastards. With that being said, we might just find through this video that for monarchs and their heirs, a question of paternity or legitimacy was frequently rather unlucky for those who were affected. Royal power, even lives, were often left hanging in the balance. Today, we're going to take a look at illegitimacy and how it played out for the royals. But we're also going to take a look at the shifting legal situation when it came to someone being legitimate or otherwise. Let's hop in. Attempting to trace the origins of the preference, even the expectation or demand, for a child to be born to married parents is somewhat tricky. Nevertheless, as Robert Bartlett explains, quote, "There is no doubt that there was frequently opposition to bastards succeeding to power, both in general principle and practical politics. In the year 786, papal legates sent by Pope Adrian I to the various kingdoms in England, who were sent to, among other things, examine the state of the faith, held a council. During this time, they asserted that, quote, in the ordination of kings, no one shall permit the assent of wicked people to prevail, but kings are to be chosen lawfully by the priests and elders, and not from among those born from adultery or incest. For just as in our own times, according to the canons, a bastard cannot be promoted to the priesthood, so neither can he who was not born of a legitimate marriage be the Lord's anointed, and king of the whole kingdom and heir of the land. So that all seems pretty cut and dried then. For the anointing of the king to occur within the bounds of canon law, and thus presumably with the blessing of God and his church, the individual being anointed must have been born to parents who were married to each other. As we're going to see, this was not always observed, because after all, nearly 2.5 centuries later, Robert the Magnificent, Duke of Normandy, had a son out of wedlock with a woman called Herleva. They named this child William. A few years later, little William's mother would even marry someone else. Nevertheless, as David Bates points out, quote, in January 1035, he, William, was formally designated as Robert's heir, with the Norman magnates swearing fealty to him, and the French king, Henri I, confirming the arrangement. Robert's death at Nicaea, on the return journey from his pilgrimage to the Holy Land, meant that William became Duke of the Normans during his 8th year. William, still just a young boy and a bastard, was left in charge. Presumably only nominally at first, but nevertheless left in charge of a volatile duchy. It was, on occasion, a potentially life-threatening situation for the new young duke, and he was, as Bates reminds us, quote, regularly described as bastardus in non-Norman contemporary sources. As we know, William would survive to take control and secure the duchy in his own right, and then, in 1066, he successfully challenged Harold Godwinson for the English crown at the Battle of Hastings. William claimed this was his right, due to him being promised the succession to the crown by Edward the Confessor, who was William's first cousin once removed. Edward's mother, Emma of Normandy, was the sister of William's grandfather, Richard the Good, Duke of Normandy. William is now most commonly remembered as William the Conqueror, rather than William the Bastard, or even William Duke of Normandy. And so it was. Despite it being in direct contravention of those legatine orders from 786, that William was crowned by Aldred, Archbishop of York, in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066. I have got a video on that event that I will be leaving linked. So, although William's parents never married each other, that was not the case for all illegitimately born children. So what of them? Those children born out of wedlock to parents who would subsequently marry. During the reign of William's great-great-great-grandson, King Henry III, the provisions of Mortain of 1035-6 were created. They are commonly thought of as the first English statute. Certainly, they are the first entry in the Statutes of the Realm, as we can see, that were printed by the command of King George III. The Statute of Mortain includes a clause, number 9, on, quote, special bastardy, which has been translated out of the original Latin as follows, quote, to the king's writ of bastardy, whether one being born before matrimony may inherit in like manner as he that is born after matrimony. All the bishops answered that they would not, nor could not answer it, because it was directly against the common order of the church. And all the bishops instanted the lords that they would consent that all such as were born afore matrimony should be legitimate, as well as they that be born within matrimony, as to the succession of inheritance, forasmuch as the church accepteth such for legitimate. And all the earls and barons with one voice answered that they would not change the laws of the realm, which hitherto have been used and approved. Richard H. Helmholtz offers context for this clause, explaining, quote, the bishops, anxious to bring the English law into accord with what they conceive to be the clear dictates of religion, reason, and civil law, urged upon the baronage the proposition that children born before the marriage of their parents should be counted as legitimate at English law. The barons refused. So are we being asked to understand through this that although the church might consider these individuals born before the marriage of their parents to be in some way spiritually legitimate, in a civil context, when it came to inheritance, for example, the nobility were unwilling to do likewise? If so, then presumably this is going to result in an elder child potentially being barred from inheriting, if that child had been born before the marriage of their parents, while a younger sibling, born in wedlock, could therefore act as the sole heir. There would, of course, be loopholes and workarounds for those with the inclination and the power to access it. Perhaps the most famous examples of this are the children who were born between around 1371 and 1379 to Edward III's fourth son, John of Gaunt, and his mistress, later third wife, Catherine Swynford. Now, this couple would not marry for nearly 2 decades after the birth of their youngest child. Their eventual wedding was grand, though, taking place at Lincoln Cathedral in the January of 1396. Their children, who carried the name Beaufort, were then made legitimate through first a papal bull in the September of 1396 and then by a royal patent of the next February 1397. And it was through this twinned ecclesiastical and civil legitimation that Henry Tudor, son of Margaret Beaufort, could arguably claim legitimate royal descent. There were, indeed there still are those, that query King Henry VII's right to the throne on the basis of the legitimacy or otherwise of his Beaufort forebears. In this, though, he was absolutely not alone, as there would be questions, even challenges and denials in regards to the legitimacy of Henry VII's father-in-law, brothers and sisters-in-law, and therefore presumably by extension his wife also, and his grandchildren. These alleged irregularities, when it came to the legitimacy of these individuals, would threaten the power of the crown. These individuals claimed the throne, and in some cases, the life and liberty of those who were being questioned. King Edward IV's foreign enemies and domestic rivals seemingly took delight in propagating a rumour, which they may or may not have believed, that he was not really the son of Richard, Duke of York. This rumour was aimed at destabilising Edward's rule and in fomenting rebellion against him so that some other person might assume the role of king. Either, it's thought, Edward's brother, George, Duke of Clarence, or Edward's predecessor, King Henry VI. It was alleged that Richard, Duke of York, and Edward's mother, Cecily Neville, had been separated by the requirements of Richard's military service at the point when conception would have been expected to occur if we take into account Edward's later birth date. And so promptly the finger of paternal suspicion in this case was pointed at a low-born French archer by the name of Blayborn. Although these rumours were certainly suppressed at the time, the question of Edward IV's paternity is still confronted by scholars today. Some point to the discrepancies in the dates of conception and of birth, Edward's quiet christening, and his reported physical difference from other members of his family, including apparently Richard, Duke of York. Other scholars, though, dismiss this, pointing out that there is a fairly wide window in which a baby can be born and be considered to be full term, which means that Edward could feasibly have been conceived either side of his father's military service. A low-key baptism doesn't automatically signal that there is something to hide, and being tall was certainly a characteristic that was shared by Edward's Plantagenet ancestors. There is also no indication that Richard, Duke of York, or Cecily Neville ever professed any doubts about who Edward's father was. Nevertheless, the allegation was dangerous. For Edward, certainly, but also ultimately for many of those who were involved in putting it about, maybe even in designing it. For them, it often proved to be more than dangerous. It proved to be deadly. After Edward IV's death, on the 9th of April 1483, it was expected, and indeed planned, that his 12-year-old son would succeed him and rule as King Edward V. And at first, all the plans seemed to be heading in that direction. The new king's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was though apparently fearful and seemingly doubtful. At the end of April, she took her other children, including the new king's brother Richard, and she fled into sanctuary at Westminster. It would take until the 16th of June for her to be convinced, maybe threatened, into allowing Richard to come out of sanctuary to go and join his elder brother so they might prepare for the coronation, which was still apparently being planned. During this period, the boys were housed at the Tower of London, as was becoming the custom for kings who were awaiting their coronation. Less than a week later, though, on the 22nd of June, it was announced that Edward IV had never really been married to Elizabeth Woodville. This was due apparently to Edward having been betrothed or pre-contracted to the conveniently long deceased Lady Eleanor Talbot, married name Butler. Through this alleged pre-contract between two now deceased parties, none of Elizabeth Woodville's children by Edward IV were apparently legitimate, and thus they had been made ineligible to inherit the throne. And so, the dead king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was proclaimed king instead. He would rule as King Richard III. By the end of that summer, or perhaps the start of the autumn, princes in the Tower were believed to be missing. Many presumed them dead. However, not everyone was willing to accept the fact that Edward V and all his siblings were somehow miraculously bastards. For them, Richard III was a usurper. And in the aftermath, support for Henry Tudor began to grow. King Richard III was killed at the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August 1485. At this point, Henry Tudor began his rule as King Henry VII. He married Edward IV's daughter, the sister of the princes in the Tower, Elizabeth of York. Their second son would succeed peacefully after his father's death in 1509 to become King Henry VIII. This king's seemingly fanatical desire for a legitimate son of his own to follow him on the throne would, as it turned out, risk the stability of his nation and complicate the succession to the crown for the better part of a century, if not for longer. In 1534, following the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, an act for the establishment of the king's succession received the royal assent. This act wrote into law that Henry's daughter by Catherine, Mary, was not lawfully begotten, not legitimate, and not heir to the throne. Catherine was, it had been ruled, never really Henry's wife, but was rather his dead brother's widow only. She was never really Queen of England. She had only ever been the Dowager Princess of Wales. Instead, the place of Henry's heir belonged rightfully to Henry's daughter by his true wife, Anne Boleyn. The real heir, therefore, was the Princess Elizabeth. In 1536, though, Anne Boleyn fell. She was condemned as a traitor and sentenced to be beheaded. Her marriage was soon annulled, seemingly on the grounds that Henry had had an affair previously with Anne's sister Mary, and this had created an illegal degree of consanguinity that made Henry and Anne's marriage incestuous and thus not valid. And thus, a new Succession Act was drafted. It received royal assent in 1536. Through this act, Elizabeth would join her half-sister Mary in illegitimacy. Both were, through this, denied a place in the succession to the crown as heirs to their father. In 1544, though, Mary and Elizabeth were provided for through another Succession Act. While through this act they would not be recognised as being Henry's lawfully begotten children, or even as princesses once again, the Lady Mary and the Lady Elizabeth, as they were styled, were returned to the line of succession. They were going to slot in after their younger brother Prince Edward and any children that he may lawfully produce, and or after any potential heirs that the king might produce with his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr. Edward VI and or his advisers were, however, not keen to recognise this as the young king lay sick and dying. And so, an attempt was made to bypass or skip over his legally bastardised sisters in favour of the line of his legitimately born cousin Francis. She had 3 daughters, all born unquestionably in wedlock. The eldest of these daughters, Lady Jane Grey, was thus thrust onto the throne after Edward IV's death. The events that transpired during the days that followed this would show that enough of Jane's new subjects seemingly cared very little for her non-bastard state, or the dead Edward's plans, or even perhaps the fate of the Church of England. They wanted the daughter of Henry VIII, and they didn't care whether she had been born of a legal marriage or not. And so, popular support began to swell around Mary Tudor, and people flocked to her banner. In Queen Mary I's first Parliament, an act declaring the Queen's Highness to have been born in a most just and lawful matrimony, and also repealing all acts of Parliament and sentences of divorce had and made to the contrary, was put forward. It would receive the royal assent towards the end of 1553. When Mary's half-sister Elizabeth followed her onto the throne, she chose not to see to it that similar legal provisions would be made in regard to her own parents' marriage. However, during her reign, her government would legislate on the state of illegitimate children through the Poor Act of 1575. I have made a video on the history of the Poor Laws that I will leave linked. Through this 1575 Act, we see that 2 justices of the peace were empowered to order the punishment of the reputed parents of bastard children, to enforce them to provide for the maintenance of those children. Reputed parents who disobeyed any such order to provide that maintenance should, according to this Act, be committed to the common jail until they were willing to comply. Just over a century after this Act became law, the parentage of a putative heir to the throne would form part of a rumour campaign that would ultimately support a foreign invasion and a revolution. James Francis Edward Stuart was born on the 10th of June 1688, and although his paternity was not questioned, his parentage was. Rumours swirled that rather than being the real issue and thus true heir of this public convert to the Roman Catholic faith, James VII and II, and his Roman Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, little baby James was actually a changeling child who had been smuggled into the Queen's childbed in a warming pan. At the end of the month, on the 30th of June 1688, 7 of King James's noble subjects wrote to William of Orange. He was the cousin husband of James's eldest daughter Mary. They asked him to invade so that he might depose his uncle and father-in-law. James, Mary, and their warming pan son would ultimately flee into exile on the continent. William and Mary's joint coronation as co-rulers took place on the 11th of April 1689. Before we wrap up today, I want to fast forward us to the 20th century, because in the 1920s, the National Council for the Unmarried Mother and Her Child, an organisation which had been founded in 1918, campaigned to bring about legal changes in relation to legitimacy or otherwise. And so we come to the Legitimacy Act of 1926, which was, quote, an act to amend the law relating to children born out of wedlock. This act allowed for children who were born out of wedlock to be legitimated just so long as they had not been conceived and born through an adulterous relationship. The Legitimacy Act of 1959 would allow for children to be recognised as being legitimate through a subsequent marriage of their parents, even if that child had been conceived through adultery. The Parliament UK website explains that, quote, a new turning point was reached in the Family Law Reform Act of 1969, which allowed people born outside of marriage to inherit on the intestacy of either parent. For the first time, the law courts could order blood tests in cases of disputed paternity, though these had been available since the 1930s. Then that the Family Law Reform Act of 1987 removed all remaining legal distinctions between children born to married and unmarried parents. An unmarried father has been able to have parental responsibility by being listed on their child's birth certificate. This has been the case from the 15th of April 2002 in Northern Ireland, from the 1st of December 2003 in England and Wales, and from the 4th of May 2006 in Scotland. When it comes to the succession to hereditary titles, the legal situation is different though. Legitimate birth in wedlock is still the expectation in these cases. In 2013, a new Succession to the Crown Act was enacted. This new act overwrote male preference primogeniture. Quote, in determining the succession to the crown, the gender of a person born after the 28th of October 2011 does not give that person or that person's descendants precedence over any other person whenever born. It removed the disqualification from, quote, succeeding to the crown or from possessing it as a result of marrying a person of the Roman Catholic faith. It also repealed the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which provides that, subject to certain exceptions, a descendant of King George II may marry only with the consent of the sovereign. Through the new 2013 Act, only, quote, a person who, when the person marries, is one of the 6 persons next in the line of succession to the crown, must obtain the consent of Her Majesty, now presumably His Majesty, before marrying. So, what do you think of these laws surrounding legitimacy? Of what the various shifts in the legal situation might have meant for people in the past, what it might mean for people today even? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. But I'd also love it if you could pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments too, because that will boost the engagement, get the video shared out more, and thus hopefully help us to grow our community. As we've been talking about inheritance and births in and out of wedlock, I'm thinking maybe something baby related, but also perhaps maybe inheritance related. So perhaps property, house, castle, crown, maybe. You pick, and also let me know why you've picked what you've picked next to the emoji, because I have been reliably informed the algorithm goblins do like words for boosting their algorithmic work, if you will. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those. That way we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please share it with your friends. Let some pals know about the channel. If you liked this video, please let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please also subscribe to the channel and check now just to make sure you've not been unsubscribed against your will if you think you are subscribed, because YouTube can be tricksy like that. While you are there, checking, subscribing, perhaps resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear, and that way YouTube claim they will tell you when I've next uploaded, but also when I'll next be going live, which at the moment I am doing once a month to talk about the history news. I get sent a bunch of great news items all about what's been going on in the world of history and adjacent topics. I put them together, then we sit down and chat about them live. At the moment, it's lasting about 2.5 hours. It's sometimes funny, sometimes serious. It's a good time and you aren't going to want to miss it. We have, of course, got our failsafe. If you head to my website, which I will leave linked, it is www.katrinamarchant.com. Head to the contact page and then put your email address in the box and then hit sign up. That will add you to my list, which will allow me to send you out an email once a week to let you know what I've been up to, but also to send you useful links for my content for the coming days. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.